Gaming has been blowing everyone's mind, with many players thinking he feels like a 5-star DPS despite being a 4-star, while others think he is being extremely overhyped. So I am here to cut through the bullshit and provide the math and give my analysis on how good he actually is. To summarize his kit, Gaming is a 4-star Pyro DPS. He uses his elemental skill to jump, which allows him to do a special plunge which deals pyro damage. This plunge has very high scaling, 489.6% at talent level 13. To put into perspective how good that is, this is higher scaling than Diluc's high plunge, and Diluc is known for having the highest plunge scaling in the entire game. And since this is considered a plunging attack, it has no ICD, which means that Gaming will apply Pyro to trigger either Vaporize or Melt on it every single time. In most rotations, Gaming will be able to use this plunge about 4 to 5 times, so that is up to like 2,448% scalings that can get fully reacted. This scaling also drains Gaming's HP. After doing the plunge, his A1 passive will heal him several times in quick succession, allowing him to easily get and maintain full stacks of the Meirashusei Hunter set after using his skill only one time. And his burst deals high pyro damage with a 787% scaling at T13, and at intervals when the Lion summoned by it returns to Gaming, it will reset his skill cooldown. This is what allows him to use his skill so many times in a rotation, so he is a burst reliant DPS. And like most other burst reliant DPS, his burst ends if you swap off of him. With the high scaling of his burst and skill combined, over a full rotation, Gaming is capable of doing about 32-35% attack scaling, which is basically the same as Zhongling's burst, and Gaming has higher stats and more self buffs than Zhongling, while being able to amplify every single hit. So things so far are looking very good for his damage potential. That's the gist of Gaming's kit, so now let's take a look at his teams and the math for them. Since Gaming doesn't have any ICD on his plunges, you really want to take advantage of this with Vaporize or Melt. Starting with Vaporize, the team you want to use is Gaming, Farina, Bennett, Jianyun. You really want to use Farina as the Hydro for her excellent buffing and damage, and also because Yelan and Zinc Show don't work out very well. You spend so much time plunging that there isn't much time to fit in normal attacks, so the Hydro application and damage from Yelan and Zinc Show ends up being much less than what you would want. Jianyun is included because her buff is absolutely massive for plunging attacks, which is the vast majority of Gaming's damage. Her enabling Gaming to jump without his skill also lets Gaming do a regular high plunge in between each skill plunge for more damage. Her team-wide healing also helps fanfare from Farina, and she is able to shred resistance with VV. However, the rotation that I have here does not shred pyro resistance with VV. This is because rotating in a way that will allow you to shred pyro will either be extremely inconsistent and unreliable, or result in terrible buff uptimes and not be worth the effort. But as you can see from the math, the numbers here are pretty absurd even without Pyro Shred. Gaming's personal damage here is a ridiculous 1.45 million, while the team DPS is an even more ridiculous 84k. This is both higher personal damage than most DPS in the game, including the best 5 stars, and more team DPS than almost every team in the game as well. If he is doing that without Pyro Swirl, imagine how absurd this would be if you could reliably swirl Pyro. Now, one important thing to point out with this team is, due to the nature of how Farina applies Hydro, you do run into the risk of Gaming applying Pyro before Farina gets a chance to reapply it, if you are just blindly plunge spamming. This is especially true in single target, since Yuanyun's off-field Anemo application will decay the Hydro aura further. However, this can be worked around by slightly delaying your plunges a bit, so if you see that the enemy does not currently have a Hydro aura, you can delay your plunge a bit so that the Hydro is reapplied before your plunge connects. In multi-wave content, You will also likely need to wait a bit for Farina to play Hydro before you can start damaging the new wave of enemies. So with this team, you really want to make sure you pay attention to the aura on the enemy and don't just blindly plunge spam. Another important thing to note is, like all Xianyun teams, Xianyun's buff is only applied to one target. So while Gaming is doing 1.45 million damage to one target, all the other enemies are taking about 975k. This, alongside the team playing inside Bennett's Burst, aka Circle Impact, with a melee unit without any grouping, plus plunge attack knockback, makes the team a lot more geared towards single target than AoE. Furthermore, Vaporize on multiple enemies in AoE can be inconsistent, since you are relying on Farina's Hydro application without any grouping to keep the enemies together for her to actually hit them both. This team can definitely still perform well in AoE if played well, but it is much better aligned to single target, despite Gaming's plunges having large AoE. One more important thing to point out with this Vaporize team is, Bennett's C6 plays a huge factor here. Gaming gets a Pyro infusion for his skill plunge, but his regular plunges from jumping with Xianyun do not, so Bennett C6 gives him that missing infusion, plus an extra 15% damage bonus. Without C6 Bennett, instead of doing a high plunge between each skill plunge, you will just chase after the line from his burst to get his skill reset as soon as possible. As we can see from the math, even without a C6 Bennett, Gaming's personal damage is over 1.2 million, the team DPS is 74k, which is still around what the average 5-star DPS does. With Vaporize covered, let's also talk about Forward Melt. With Melt, the strongest team I've calculated is Gaming, Xianyun, Bennett, and Kaya. The DPS of this team isn't that far behind Vaporize, coming in at about 80k. Melt has a higher multiplier than Vaporize for Pyro, and we actually get to shred Pyro with VV here. However, we miss out on Farina's buffing and personal damage, which is worth quite a lot. Kaya's burst only lasts 8 seconds, so we don't get to use Gaming on field for any longer than that. One important thing to keep in mind with this team is, since this is Forward Melt, each instance of Pyro application will completely remove the Cryo, so you need really fast Cryo to ensure you keep reapplying Cryo in time. Because of this, for this team, your Kaya has to be C6. C6 Kaya applies Cryo about once per second, which is enough if you time your plunges when needed. But before C6, his Cryo application will not be fast enough. But you can still play Melt even if you don't have a C6 Kaya. In this case, I recommend playing Gaming, Bennett, Layla, Rosaria. Without C6, you need double Cryo to reliably melt, and Rosaria and Layla are the ideal duo for this. Rosaria will grant you about 12 to 15% crit rate, along with another 15% from Cryo Resonance, and she does some decent damage of her own. Meanwhile, Layla provides consistent Cryo application from her skill and burst, while providing you with the second strongest shield in the entire game. Her shielding is a nice convenience to have, because if Gaming gets interrupted while in the air before he can plunge, you will lose a ton of damage. She is also capable of buffing Gaming further if you have Key of Catch in his Stroot, but if you don't, helping with team energy with Favonius is still plenty good enough. The DPS is lower here than the other two teams, but it still comes in at like 73k, which is still pretty good, and still around what most 5-star DPS do. And this team is all 4-star units, with Layla and Rosaria not even needing many Constellations. Rosaria is nearly complete at C2, and Layla does everything she needs to at C0, though you do want some Constellations to make her shield stronger. So Gaming is doing more damage and more team DPS than most teams in the entire game. The main caveat that I can say he has is you do play Circle Impact with him since he uses Bennett. And since Kazuha is not optimal for Gaming, he doesn't have any grouping either, so That, plus some of the other problems that I pointed out earlier, results in him being pretty heavily leaned towards single target rather than AoE, and also some multi-wave issues. But aside from that, he's looking really good. So now let's go over how to build gaming. Starting with his weapons, I have a separate set of calcs for Vape and Melt, as things are different. In Melt, the best weapons will be Serpent Spine, Vortic, Redhorn, Melt Flower, and Beacon. Tidal Shadow is a good FTP option if you don't have Melt Flower. In Vape, Rain Slasher is unironically his best weapon, since he vaporizes all of his damage. The 165 Elemental Mastery goes very far on him. It also gives a lot of damage bonus. Other good weapon options include Redhorn, Serpent Spine, Melt Flower, Beacon, and Verdict. For his artifacts, for the main stats, you want an EM Sands, Pyro Goblet, and Crit Circlet. EM Sands is about 8 to 13% better than an Attack Sands, so I do not advise trying to use an Attack Sands. For the artifact sets, there are 3 sets you should be considering on gaming: Meira Shusei Hunter, Crimson Witch, and Gilded Dreams. Meira Shusei Hunter is his best set in Melt, ahead of Crimson Witch and Gilded Dreams by about... in Vaporize, Meira Shusei Hunter is his best set, ahead of Crimson Witch and Gilded Dreams by about 6%. And Crimson Witch and Gilded Dreams are about equal to each other. And then in Melt, his best set is Crimson Witch. It pulls ahead of the Hunter set since you are already getting a lot of crit rate from Rosaria and Cryo Resonance. You don't need any more. But if you're using Kaya C6 Solo Cryo, then the Hunter set would still be the best set. Finally, let's go over his constellations and how important they each are. His C1 mixes burst heal him by 15% of his HP each time the lion returns to him. This doesn't help his damage, but it's some decent extra sustain. C2 gives him 20% more attack anytime gaming gets overflow healing. It's about a 4 to 5% damage increase. Nothing insane, but more damage is more damage. C3 is his second best constellation since it increases his skill, which is the source of most of his damage. This will be about a 13% damage increase. C4 is also great, giving him 2 energy each time he does the plunge from his skill, which brings down his energy requirements very nicely. C5 adds 3 talent levels to his burst. It's not a huge increase, but his burst is front-loaded damage, so this is more front-load. Good stuff. And C6, as you would expect, is his best constellation. It gives 20% crit rate and 40% crit damage to the plunge from his skill. This is a massive 17% damage increase. On top of the damage increase, C6 also increases his AoE, giving him genuinely very massive AoE on each plunge. It makes the AoE on his plunges about the same size as Zhao. So overall, his constellations are very nice, but how important is it to have them? And is he still functional at C0? At C0 in the Vaporize team, he's still doing over 1 million personal damage per rotation. The team DPS is like 66k. This is about 21% less team DPS than a C6 gaming, which is a lot less, but C6 is still plenty decent enough. 66k DPS, yeah, that's still plenty decent enough. His constellations are great, and you definitely want to C6 him over time, but you shouldn't feel forced to go deep for C6 right away. If you can, I would try to aim for at least C4, as not needing the ER will make building him a lot more convenient, but it's fine if you can't get there. Just aim to C6 him over time as he gets reruns. Also, one last thing I want to address is, I've seen an argument against C6 gaming's power level, that being, since C6 4 stars can be as hard to get as C2 5 stars, it makes more sense to compare his C6 power level to that of 5-star DPS at C2, in which case he obviously won't compare. And that is fair. However, gaming and Jianyun are on the same banner, so if we argue that it costs you a C2 5-star level of pulls to get a C6 gaming, then he's coming along a C2 Jianyun anyway, so we have to account for that. and a C6 gaming with a C2 Xianyun does about a 100k team DPS with over 1.8 million personal damage per rotation from a gaming, with this skill plunges easily doing over 300,000 each. Compare that to the team DPS of other 5-star DPS at the C2 level, such as Linny and Novelette to give a few examples. They come in at around 97k, so gaming is still very competent with 5-star DPS, even if you make the C6 4-star is equal to C2 5-star argument. And alright, yeah, that covers everything, so let's debrief. At C6, gaming has some of the highest personal damage in the entire game. He has good front load with his burst, able to easily crit for like 250k with it. And his sustained damage is also great. And while C6 4-stars can be hard to get, he is still a good character even before C6. He is, in my opinion, one of the best 4-star units in the entire game, and likely one of the best single target DPS overall, if not the best single target DPS. His main downsides are AoE, and he requires some skill expression with timing your plunges to not miss vapes. But aside from that, he is very powerful, and I would say he's worth the hype. If you like big numbers and his playstyle appeals to you, I think you will love gaming with gaming. But his gameplay is definitely an acquired taste. I think a lot of people will also be very off-put by his playstyle, so I'd recommend getting a feel for him in the test run as much as you can before deciding to pull for him. It's far from an ideal testing scenario, but it can give you a basic feel for his gameplay. If you liked today's video, please be sure to give a like and subscribe, and comment down below letting me know your thoughts. Thanks. Bye.